Now, Downing Street insists that David Cameron will still push for curbs on in-work benefits for EU migrants in the UK, despite earlier briefings suggesting the contrary. The Prime Minister will head to a crucial summit later this week to make his case for a reformed British relationship with the EU. However, several newspapers, citing official guidance, report that Mr Cameron has failed to convince other European leaders and is already preparing a fallback to replace his original demand for a 4-year wait for in-work benefits. Here's the Sunday Times headline. It says, Prime Minister caves in on migrant benefits. Sunday Telegraph describes it as Mr Cameron's climb down on EU benefits. And The Independent on Sunday goes with the same metaphor, describing it as Cameron's big EU climb down. Let's speak now to a prominent Conservative backbencher, MP Peter Lilley. He was a cabinet minister in the Conservative governments of both Margaret Thatcher and John Major. Peter Lilley, welcome to the programme. The Prime Minister is thought by many of your colleagues not to be asking for a lot, yet he might not even get what he's asking for. Could he sell a watered-down deal to his party?
Well, it's more a question of whether he can sell whatever comes out of it to the country. This isn't a party business, and there are lots of Labour MPs who want to see democratic powers returned to this country from the European institutions. That's the key issue as far as I'm concerned. He will clearly get some things because a lot of this has been pre-negotiated, as it were, so he'll get something to say about removing the phrase ever closer union, something to do with benefits, even if actually it's something we could do anyway ourselves, like apply a 4-year wait to British citizens as well as foreigners. So there'll be something. The question is, will it be substantial? Will it include a return of powers to this country to govern itself?
Well, what major powers is he asking to be repatriated?
Well, publicly there doesn't seem to be anything on the list unless some change in relation to free movement of labour, giving us power to do things that we don't currently have, is somewhere up his sleeve. I do occasionally hear rumours that he's going to surprise us all and come back with some genuine return of powers. If he does, I'll be dancing on the rooftops.
But he's not asking for any of that. We have no evidence that that's even part of the negotiation.
Well, that is certainly disappointing. It's rather a strange strategy not to ask for the principal thing we want and yet still hope to get it. Because we have, over a series of treaties, which David Cameron and I voted against, conceded a whole lot of powers to Europe beyond what is necessary to run a common trading area. We all accept that that requires some common lawmaking. But beyond that, we concede a lot of powers. We'd like to get some of that back and to start the process of getting those powers back. If we don't and we can't, then we'll be very much on a slippery slope to creating a single state. The reason we're in the position we are, we're having to renegotiate, is that the countries of the Eurozone are on an escalator to creating a single state. There's never been a currency without a state and a government to run it, equipped with powers to tax, borrow, spend, regulate, transfer money and so on. They're forced, because they've created this currency, without a government now to create the government to make it work. The question is, can we be outside that process? Can we actually move in the opposite direction and get powers back? Or will we be sucked on the slipstream?
Okay.
And if we can't overcome the sort of two doctrines of Europe, that everybody's heading in the same direction, albeit at different speeds, and that powers can only ever go to central institutions and never come back to member states. If we can't break those two doctrines as far as Britain's concerned, then he'll have not really have achieved anything. If he can break those doctrines in quite small respects,
I understand all that.
I think that was a great triumph.
I've got a quick final question for you. If he comes back with even less than he's asking for, would you vote to leave?
If he doesn't come back with some increase in powers to govern ourselves, I fear I would, for the first time in my life, be voting to leave. I voted to stay in 75, but I would vote to leave in those circumstances.
Peter Lilley, thank you for joining us this morning. Tom, it's turning into a real mess for the government, is it not?
It's a huge mess. Yeah, there was a wonderful little expose yesterday of something called The Call. I don't know if you've come across this. The 11 p.m. call every Saturday night, which from Downing Street, coordinated by Downing Street Switchboard, which all the press officers and special advisors and ministers going on Sunday broadcasts have to tune into. It was over the Blair years, and it was fascinating to hear the Renegotiation. I can only imagine the horror which underwent between sort of 10:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. last night during The Call, which still happens, over the headlines this morning. I think what's happened here is the 4-year ban on migrants' benefits is dead. It's
you think it is got? He's just not going to get it.
It is dead. It died, I would say, at least a month ago when the Chatham House speech, when the Prime Minister first wrote to Donald Tusk. He said so in his speech by saying, here's what I want, but by the way, I'll also accept anything else you choose to offer me. So my paper and others and Sam's reported the next day that 4 years was effectively dead in the water. So what we're talking about now is the choreographing, how it happens and whether the Prime Minister himself has to withdraw it or, which is what I think might happen, someone else might put something else on the table at the summit on Thursday, doing the PM a favour, perhaps the Germans, perhaps the Dutch, to bail him out and say, OK, if you don't want this, how about that?
Peter Lilley said, when I said, can he sell this to his backbench? He said, well, it's a problem for other parties too. But this is overwhelmingly a problem for the Conservatives. And if he cannot even achieve what he's asking for now, I would suggest that at least half the parliamentary party may well not go with him on this.
I think it's really interesting to look at those headlines which talk about this big climb down. I think it's not the climb down I would query, but the big. I mean, I very rarely agree with Dominic Cummings, who's leading one of the Vote Leave campaigns.
The Leave campaign.
But he's asked for trivia and he hasn't even got that. I mean, he needed one sort of totemic issue that looked like he was doing something about immigration, which we know is a really big issue. Even he couldn't look at the free movement of people or any kind of EU migrant cap because those things are just not going to be happening without treaty change.
Peter Lilley couldn't tell us of any major power he's asking to be repatriated.
So he's asked for quite small things and not even got those. I think it's going to be very hard to make at any point look like he's come back with something really emblematic and everyone can say, OK, that's changed my mind and now I'm going to vote to stay in.
So we don't think there'll be a deal done this week. In fact, almost certainly not. It's now being pushed back to February. If he gets one in February, can he have the referendum in June? Can he have it in September? I understand the Electoral Commission doesn't like the idea of a referendum that would overlap with the May elections, local, Scotland, Wales. And the risk in September is that we'll have another summer migrant crisis, and that would be a terrible atmosphere for those who want to stay in the European Union.
There are an awful lot of hurdles. I mean, first of all, you've got to get a deal in February that looks like a success. And at the moment, the reason they've done what they've done overnight is because it's all being dragged down into a kind of quasi-legal quagmire. And David Cameron's got to have a big picture conversation with all of his EU counterparts in order to make it sort of set the entire renegotiation back on the right track. Can they sort it all out by February? Well, I know some people in Brussels are saying if you can't get a deal by February, March, we're never going to get a deal, and if it slips into 2017, you won't get a deal then either.
George Osborne's view.
But then in June, there is the tiniest window, because of all of these different now electoral and legal hurdles, there is only a tiny window at the end of June where you could practically hold a vote because of the Electoral Commission, because of other commitments the government made in law. That looks fleetingly difficult. But then, as you say, you've got the migrant crisis, which pops up over the summer. I'm told that actually dealing with the Turks and the flow of migration from Turkey will make an enormous difference to the optics of how Europe is seen to be able to deal with the migration crisis. So actually, even though that doesn't have a huge impact on UK migration from the rest of Europe, David Cameron's renegotiation depends on something that is truly out of his control.
OK, so you tell me it depends on the Turks now. We'll see how that works out next summer.